Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. David Hardy from Collegiate Sports Medicine, and today we're talking about brain flow and what happens in concussions. So before we get started, what I'd like you to do is just take a brief moment and pause this video. And I want you to think about one of your fondest memories or just a memory that comes to your mind when you start thinking about things that have happened, whether it's good or bad. All right, great. So you've taken that time, you've kind of reflected over this memory. Hopefully you've written it down so you can kind of look at it in a little bit more detail as we go along here. So if you love action, as I do, then the best sport in the world is going to be rugby. Well, of course, I'm a little biased there. But I can still kind of remember the first time I went out onto a rugby field and played. It was just absolutely sheer chaos and just this amazing experience. So in high school, we all, of course, jumped on the bus, and it was an out-of-town tournament. And of course, people who have played before are going through all these different stories about how great the sport is, and you're just kind of sitting listening to these stories, getting more and more nervous because you realize you're about to go out onto a field and there's going to be a whole bunch of people running at you, trying to tackle you, trying to drive you into the ground or the dirt. So we get there, it's early in the morning, the pitch still has that kind of foggy dew-like smell to it. The grass is moist, wet. There's mud everywhere, and then of course we go through all the chanting and pregame antics, and then all of a sudden it's kickoff time, and none of us who have never played before have any clue what we're supposed to be doing. We're just kind of hoping that maybe the ball comes to us or that we're part of the action, or some of us are even hoping that it doesn't come to us right off the bat. And then as the game goes along, you start running. You're once again looking all over the place, trying to figure out what is going on. It's just sheer chaos and sensory stimulation coming at you. And then you start to feel how tight your muscles get. You're constantly just breathing, your lungs are burning, and next thing you know, you're in these contact situations and you're loving this game and just going with it. It's a complete, absolute rush. So why would I go through that to explain all this and how the brain works? Well, everything in our stories and our memories basically start out as sensory words. So whether it's auditory, whether it's kinesthetic, taste, smell, all of these have a huge reaching implication and are describing basically how different parts of our brain are taking in all this information. And without this, we're not going to have good stories or memories. So the richer the story, the more sensory words are usually used. If somebody was just talking about just plain facts, well, it doesn't form a good story or memory. It might be interesting for a little bit, but eventually it's going to be boring. The more sensory words, the better the story, the better the words. So life really is a sensory experience. Your memories depend on how well your brain processes your senses. Remember, emotions are feelings. So the root word of feelings is feel. If these sensations become altered in any form, then it becomes maddening or just dulled and boring. So the question I usually always ask people when I first start out is, what type of organ is the brain? Well, spoiler alert, I already gave it away. It is a sensory organ. So when you look in pretty much any neurology textbook or anatomy textbook and you flip to the brain section, it's going to go into this little groove in the middle of the brain called the central sulcus. The back part of the brain is all sensory processing information, and the front part of the brain is all motor activity. So even though we like to describe all these tiny little chemicals in the brain, what we're looking at here is processing of information coming into the system and then how we use it. So all this information is going to come in through different receptors in our body. Those receptors fire down through nerves, go through our spinal cord, and up into our brain. There's basically two root origins of this information. This information is either going to come in from the outside world or from internally, our inside environment. So when we look at this light, sound, taste, touch, smell, movement, gravity, temperature, it all kind of seems a little boring just looking at it. But when we think about light, well, think about your movies. Think about, once again, all these things that come in and form these memories. You need this information, and even though it's just boiled down to kind of one word, one sensation, these sensations are abundant and rich when they're used properly in our brain. So in concussions, well, things don't quite work out as well as we would like them to. We always think, well, doesn't this always work properly? Can't everyone take in light, sound, and have proper thoughts? Well, no. Things go wrong, and there's several things. Our perceptions are often skewed, so they become more skewed when there's an injury such as a concussion or head injury. They can become skewed in different brain and mental health disorders, neurodegenerative disorders such as aging, neurodevelopmental disorders where different parts of the brain aren't developing at the same pace that they should be. Headaches, quite commonly, once again, altered sensations and function. And POTS, which stands for postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, and we'll go in a little more detail with that because it's common in concussions and brain injuries as well. And then, of course, some hereditary diseases such as like Huntington's disease that cause all sorts of really, really disabling functions in people. So concussions, we look at all these symptoms. So confusion, moodiness, sound sensitivities, light sensitivities, irritability, neck pain, coordination problems, depression, blurred vision, double vision, headaches, muscle tightness, brain fog. Once again, we're looking at the processing of all this information coming into our brain. For instance, being frustrated. You feel frustration. Well, why are you feeling frustration? Well, our inside world isn't matching up to the outside world, and it's skewed, and we can become frustrated and angry that we're not able to process things or react to things appropriately. Brain fog, once again, kind of just diminished function within the brain. Of course, we see increased addiction rates. Well, why would we do that? Well, why would somebody use a drug? They're trying to change how they feel or function. Increased rates of dementia, so decline after these injuries, because oftentimes concussions go untreated. My concussion history, well, the first one I ever had was when I was maybe elementary school, and I had this BMX bike which I used to take off jumps and all sorts of things, and just one time one of the buddies from down the street said, yeah, let's go racing. So I had my flip-flops on, I get on the bike, and he is on the road, and I'm on the sidewalk, and we're going as fast as possible, trying to beat each other. And then all of a sudden, another kid runs out right in front, and I smash into them. Probably went over the handlebars, I don't know. Skinned myself, really kind of had that whiplash of hitting the ground and scraping up my face, everything. And then once kind of the crying stopped and everything else, then I remember lying in my bed, and I started to get dizzy. Then I threw up, and it was like I was kind of in this haze, and things was just going wrong with me. And I kind of remember how scary that was, even back as a child. And then later, my other concussions would be from contact sports. In rugby, I was dump tackled on the back of my head. I received standing 8 count one time in a martial arts tournament. And then my last concussion in rugby, I was on my feet. I stayed on my feet, but I was looking probably the wrong direction and got twisted and torqued. And later on, I just knew things weren't right with me. So a lot of bad dizziness, altered sensations, and it was kind of like, well, being on this horrible bad trip that you might experience if you had taken a hallucinogenic or something. And then all sorts of bizarre thoughts kind of follow afterwards, and once again, you're on this edge, and it's absolutely maddening, to say the least. So in essence, though, our senses become skewed, and it robs us of this experiences. Instead of a good, healthy memory, things become altered. So why do we measure balance in concussions? Well, it's a common symptom, and it leads to other symptoms. So the analogy I commonly use is, well, how well can you think when you're dizzy? And the answer to that, of course, is you can't. You're not going to have clear thoughts if your brain's spending all this time trying to figure out where on earth you are. And anxiety and balance, well, yeah, there's a huge connection between the two. So a lot of these things afterwards I kind of mask as being mental issues or issues, have an underlying brain reason to it as well. Now, our vision can also become skewed, and more importantly, kind of the position of our eyes. Our eyes are there to orientate us, and our maps of where our eyes should be pointed, quite commonly that integration is going to become messed up in concussions as well. And this is commonly why we see the double vision, is because the ocular alignment of the eyes are going to be off as well. And this is something you can see in many of the patients and people that come through with concussions. So did you know that there is a higher rate of Alzheimer's disease in people who have had concussions? Did you know that the prison population has a very high incident of concussion history? Did you know people with concussions are more likely to have depression later in life? Here's what we're doing about it. We're hacking your nervous system with targeted exercises, stimulations, and metabolic support to get you better. Where does this all start? It all starts with the neurologic examination. And there's a ton of textbooks out there. The neuro examination is nothing new. The difference is, instead of looking at the neuro exam for pathologies like a stroke tumor, we're looking at it as a functional approach to see what parts of the brain are not working properly, whether it's overactive or underactive, so that we can design therapies and treatments to target those parts of the brain. Well, why do you have to be this specific with different pathways? Why can't you just learn some tricks or do this exercise or take this recommendation? The reason is the brain is an on-off between different circuits or a push-pull. And balance is a good example of that. If one balance system is working well and the other one isn't, then there's this imbalance and hence the symptom of dizziness. So we look at it. We can excite one part of the brain and it might inhibit another part of the brain, or vice versa. We can inhibit a part of the brain and another part of the brain might become excited. So there's always this cascade through these different pathways. And we need to figure out what part of the brain is dysfunctional so that these can work more appropriately. Bilateral therapies often don't work because there's always going to be a site of dysfunction that's greater than another site. Well, the pathways, it can become pretty complicated. So on the left there, we've got different pathways just for acupuncture. And then on the right of the screen there, we've got cranial nerves. So cranial nerves are an important tool because these nerves are going to take in, once again, sensory processing from many important things: balance, taste, breathing, gut function, muscle tone, eye movements, all these things that keep us up and functioning properly. Eye movements are a key. Different eye movements are going to tell me about different parts of the brain, and different directions are going to tell me about different parts of the brain as well. So if we know these pathways, then once again we can become specific with what we need to do later on when we give different eye movements or different exercises to feed into these parts of the brain, once again training them to become better and function. So in essence, yeah, the neurology part, it's complicated. So let's just look at the flow of this information coming in through the brain. So of course, sensory information comes in, it fires into the primitive centers of your brainstem and cerebellum. The cerebellum, that little back part of the brain there, in the circle here, has roughly about 50 to 60% of all the neurons in the brain tucked into this small little area. Now the centers that actually produce some of these chemicals, your dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine, norepinephrine, all get stimulated and fire up into the limbic emotional centers. So this is one of the reasons why we can feel something or we can be startled by this sensory information and have this feeling that just hits us and we don't know where it came from. From there, the information is sent forward to our motor or output centers, our thinking and reasoning brain. So once again, we feel before we can think. And then our thinking centers fire down and basically say, yes, let's do something, or no, let's not. And actually 90% of our frontal lobes is actually inhibition, firing down, telling other parts of the brain to hold off or not do something. So why are the brainstem and cerebellum such an important area to know what's going on and what inputs go into there? Is because these are often the parts of the brain that are damaged in a concussion. Yeah, you've got your coop contra coop where the brain just kind of smashes back and forth in the skull, but if you think of it as this oddly shaped ball on top of this brainstem and spinal cord, anytime you hit and move the ball, it's going to twist, torque, and shear these primitive structures of the brain and cause them to not work properly. So balance, we commonly mention balance. Balance, posture, movements, focus. All of these are basically what keeps us up on our feet. So if we were to narrow it down, the three things that keep us on our feet are going to be, once again, our inner ear or balance centers. And we've got that right here. Then we've got feedback from muscles and joints, and it's a huge stimulation. So anytime you stretch a muscle, of course you feel it. Anytime you move a muscle or a joint, information's being sent up to the brain. That's going to be key. Then eye movements. So all of this is information coming into the brain. And it's the blue little arrows there. And it's going to be processed once again in these primitive centers of the brain. So input, then you have processing, and then finally that leads to output. So why might somebody get dizzy when they get up quickly, or when they move into a different position? Or why might they get more headaches? Well, all this information sends signals out, and it's going to send it to muscles and glands. Well, here, part of that information going out is going to be towards blood vessels. You have a limited amount of blood in the body, and it needs to be shunted towards where the brain thinks it needs to go. So if this processing and output are thrown off, then you're going to have different constriction and dilation of blood vessels, once again leading to other symptoms: lightheadedness, dizziness, headaches, disorientation, not being able to think properly because blood flow is not getting up into the brain, into different regions that need that energy. And it's also going to send signals back down to the muscles and joints and the postural muscles. So this is another reason why we start to get that muscle spasticity, rigidness, tightness, or joints that aren't moving or functioning properly. And all of this is going to be on a sliding scale of things really not working well, all the way up to peak performance. So if you look at, once again, different conditions where this mechanism is causing issues: POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. Somebody may move their head or bend down, and all of a sudden that information coming in telling us where that blood should be sent is going to be thrown off, causing, once again, different output of cardiovascular function, vasculature, and leading to all sorts of horrible symptoms. Once again, headaches can be a result of it, dizziness, lightheaded, disorientation, and it might just be minor or subtle things that you don't notice until you exert yourself. And then all the way up to peak performance. So you look at an athlete where this is functioning perfectly, they're able to send blood to where it needs to go in a very, very efficient manner, and it's firing at a top-notch rate. So think of your tumbling sports where somebody's constantly spinning, tumbling, moving at a fast rate, and their system's able to react within split seconds. That's where we'd like to get people to. And of course, it kind of depends on how severe an injury was, or how much practice or learning and adapting we're doing to make these changes. Now, once again, if we were only to look at those few spots in the brain that we mentioned so far, the brainstem and cerebellum, if we were to look at the chemical side of things, your neurotransmitter, your dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, epinephrine, acetylcholine, the nuclei, the big centers that produce these chemicals or outputs, once again originate mainly in our brainstem areas, So if somebody's using or being prescribed or taking maybe an SSRI to increase serotonin, what it's doing is chemically hacking that part of the brain to produce more of these chemicals. The downside, obviously, between different medications is you can get downregulation of, of these neurotransmitters. Whereas if you're able to put a stimulation into that part of the brain or fire these centers, then in essence, you can start to make stronger connections, producing hopefully more of these feel-good chemicals and improving function along the way. Another way to look at all of this is basically neurons fire at a certain rate. And well, can we measure that? Yes, we can. It's called brain waves. So looking at the frequency of how these neurons fire. So these neurons fire, and at the end they send off a little chemical messenger for the next neuron. But basically it's looking at the firing, this electrochemical information being sent to the next part of the brain, sorry. And we can look at, well, different areas of the brain, how well they're communicating between each other, and we can look at all of the different brainwave frequencies from low frequency, associated more with bodily functions, to very high frequency brainwaves, associated more with output and basically stimulation and alertness within the outside world. We can look at what parts of the brain, once again, are overactive. Here we've got it in red and orange. Or we can look at what areas of the brain and what frequencies are underactive. It basically comes down to too much, too little, or just the right amount of firing. So if we're able to tell what parts of the brain are underactive, then we can hopefully increase the stimulation into that part of the brain and bring it up. If a part of the brain is way too active, then hopefully we can find a way to dampen that, whether by inhibiting it with another stimulation, or whether we take stimulation away so it doesn't fire as excessively as it does. And it basically just comes down to Goldilocks and the three little brains. So what if we could train your brain to handle more? That would require us to look at our thoughts, our chemistry, and the stimulation into the brain. And the three ways we can actually change each one of these symptoms is to do it at the correct frequency, how often we do it, the intensity, how meaningful it is, and the duration, how long we do it for. We need to get those correct in order to make that correct change in the specific spots. So if somebody is damaged and has very fragile working of these different parts, then we know we can't do a high duration, so that is out of the question. We know that intensity can't be that high. So commonly in injuries, we need to look at the frequency of the therapies we do, once again, in order to make that change. And maybe we're able to brighten your world. So in my concussion, the biggest thing I noticed was that afterwards, things kind of started to go dull and hazy for me. And it wasn't until I actually went and saw somebody myself and given these silly little exercises, whether it's an eye movement, a coordination exercise, deep breathings, something to stimulate that part of the brain, I was living over here on this dull, hazy side of things. And the amazing thing when I first went for my own concussions and saw a functional neurology practitioner, that on day 3, it was like a switch flipped in my brain. And I felt this calm come over me that I had never really experienced before. And my vision went crisper, sharper, clearer. And it wasn't till many years later that I finally found this article in the New York Times explaining basically what's going on, and that other people have had this as well, where our senses start to go dull, hazy, and it can be gradual, or it can be sharp, um, and very traumatic. Getting people better though, and phasing them into this once again better functioning approach, depending on what part of the brain was damaged, injured, or not functioning properly, is the key. And we're hoping that, once again, doing this at the right frequency, intensity, duration in the specific areas we find are going to lead to many more changes in what you're experiencing. If you have any questions, please give us a call. I set up free consults in the functional neurology realm to see if you're a good fit for our programs. And our promise is we don't accept patients that we don't believe we can make a change with.